The year was 1999. The new millennium loomed on the horizon. The Matrix made history in theaters. Michael Jordan announced his second retirement. The Sega Dreamcast arrived in September with a wealth of new games, and the eternal battle between Quake 3 Arena and Unreal Tournament would begin. 1999 also marked the introduction of the Nvidia GeForce, a line of graphics cards which persists to this very day. I'm talking about the Nvidia GeForce 256. Nvidia christened this the world's first consumer GPU as a result of its new onboard geometry and lighting capabilities, a label some might dispute, but really, this is just one of many first-generation products whose features would inevitably become part of the standard going forward. And, thanks to help from Nvidia, I was able to discuss this original card and more with someone who was there, Phil Scott. Phil has been part of Nvidia for years, but in the late 90s, he was a key part of Rage Software as well, and has direct experience working on all sorts of graphics cards during this burgeoning era. As someone that purchased a GeForce 256 near launch then, I want to present two sides of the experience, circa 1999. My perspective as a PC gamer during this era, and Phil's perspective as a developer who was there. During this journey, we'll discuss the legacy of GeForce 256, I'll introduce you to numerous early graphics card demos, the suite of 3D Mark benchmarks, and some of the first hardware T&L accelerated games, all while we discuss the state of the industry during this time with Phil himself. So, power up your Pentium 3, and let's get started. This is 3D Mark 2000. If you were into PC gaming at the turn of the century, you were probably familiar with 3D Mark. While designed as a benchmarking suite at heart, 3D Mark served as a graphic showcase for most users, demonstrating what was possible in hardware of this era. It was like tasting the future before the future had come to pass. But perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself here. You see, by the time 3D Mark rolled around, 3D accelerator cards had become established as the new baseline, and many of the most beloved gaming franchises would also begin their life during this period. It was an exciting time for lovers of PC gaming, and an exciting time for developers.
I'm Phil Scott. I've been at Nvidia 21 years now. I'm the Director of Developer Relations in Europe. I worked at Rage back from 1996 through to late 2000. It was a great place to be at the time. The place was full of industry luminaries, and it was a really exciting time. It was at the advent of GPUs. One of my colleagues had basically had a lot of success with a game called Incoming, which I think a lot of people will remember now.
Incoming by Rage Software is an arcade-style combat game that has players fighting off waves of aliens as they swarm your base of operations. It's a simple game, but it's well known for its visual prowess, sporting all sorts of cutting-edge technology, especially for a game released in early 1998.
The studio I worked at was the Newcastle studio, way up in the northeast of England, and we made a game called Expendable, also known as Millennium Soldier, in different parts of the world and on different platforms.
Expendable is the game that followed Incoming a year or so later. This one resembles an overhead run-and-gun style game, borrowing elements from titles such as Robotron and Contra alike.
It was a cool project to work on because we got to aim for something that was, unrealistic in terms of what the platform was when we started. Our CEO came to see us, and because of the success that Incoming was having, he basically told us to make a game for a platform that didn't exist. He said, just shoot for the stars. There isn't a GPU out there that should be able to run this, and that's basically our starting position. And that's why we started just adding crazy amounts of lights, crazy amounts of explosions, which is probably what the game's most famous for, and all this sort of newfangled GPU stuff that was around, such as bump mapping and anti-aliasing, anisotropic filtering, multi-texture, all these terms that we take as modern day common things. They were really new. It's like the new frontier of rendering.
But before we even get to 1999, we need to consider the evolution of hardware during this era. Development was moving at lightning speed, with a huge number of vendors producing chips trying to compete with the 3DFX Voodoo. One of the first cards which managed to stack up, though, is in fact an Nvidia card, the Riva 128.
When we started Expendable as a project, we got new PCs. It had a Riva 128. That Riva 128 basically was put alongside a machine that had, I think it was an S3 version with a 3DFX in it. And it was just, that was the first couple of GPUs that we had to play with. You know, both of them, it was like, you know, this Nvidia card, it definitely keeps up with the 3DFX, which was a Voodoo 1. It keeps up, but it also didn't have to, you didn't have all this weirdness about one being a core processor that sat on top of another GPU and you had to enumerate things to get at it. It was kind of a simpler thing. The main display buffer was the 3D surface. So you just had a bit more direct access. You know, each of them had their own quirks, you know, things like texture filtering, accuracy and sub-pixel filtering and, you know, boundaries of, you know, where it would sample from the next pixels and stuff. You kind of learned your way around that a little bit. We then got the TNT, and the first TNT that we got was blisteringly fast. I mean, it was like a step function almost in terms of the quality of what it had, and because it had the twin texture, that's where the name came from, was twin texture. Because it had that, it was like, oh, you can do all of this. Whereas on a Voodoo 2, to get twin texture, you effectively had to put sort of things in different places, and when you were doing SLI at the time, you had to, if you were going to do multi-texture, you had to put one set of textures on one GPU, one set of textures on another, and tell the two to work together.
While the 3DFX Voodoo 2 reigned supreme during this era, the Riva TNT is the card that ultimately put Nvidia on the map, at least as far as being a serious competitor. It was clear that 3D cards were here to stay. The idea of offloading 3D calculations to an add-in board proved very popular, but the API situation was still challenging for developers, which is why Glide, 3DFX's proprietary API, remained so popular up through the end of the 90s. It's really only with DirectX 6 that things started to really improve.
DirectX 5 was superseded by DirectX 6 very quickly, and that's really where I think that was the real leveler, where everyone went, yeah, this is the one where GPUs are really starting to take a hold. So it was a very cool and interesting time, and you'd get the game, you'd get a new GPU, you'd stick it in a machine, you'd put the drivers in, and they're like, will it work? Is it going to work? Oh, it works. Okay, we've got to fix that. We've got to find what that is. Where's fog gone? Fog would just disappear on some GPUs. Lots and lots of things, or colors wouldn't quite match up, like the fog color wouldn't be the same color as a texture color, even though they were set to the same value. Just lots and lots of weird little things that you wouldn't even think about today.
At last we arrive at 1999, and this would prove to be a pivotal year for the industry. 3D cards had become increasingly ubiquitous. DirectX 7 would be unleashed in September. More and more games released requiring a 3D accelerator card to even run, and the market we know now would begin to crystallize. In fact, by the end of '99, the only serious players left were 3DFX, ATI, and Nvidia. Sure, Matrox and S3, along with VideoLogic and others, were still hanging in there, but them, along with the rest of the pack, would not retain a strong market presence. For developers like Phil, though, the latest cards such as GeForce 256 would begin to arrive for testing.
So we shipped Expendable in April 1999. The first we'd been told about it, a couple of vendors had been talking about hardware T&L sort of loosely, right? And what I mean by that was they were asking if we were using there was a fixed function pipeline that was already in DirectX 6. You know, for doing matrix multiplies and using DirectX lights and that kind of thing. I went across to Liverpool for a meeting with Nvidia where myself, Ian Moran, who made Incoming, I think Kevin Edwards, who'd also worked on that, like basically a bunch of the rendering guys from the studios had gone there to meet with David Kirk, who was Nvidia's chief scientist at the time. And he sat down and he was kind of talking about, you know, things that that potentially were coming in this next GPU. But we continued conversing about what was coming down the line. Now, so as we finished the game in April 1999, was right around the time that the first samples started showing up. So I went from finishing a game to having this brand new piece of hardware that I could just completely retarget what polygon budgets would be.
The first GeForce 256 product would arrive in October 1999. It would be the first fully DirectX 7 compliant graphics card on the market, and it commanded the attention of PC gamers everywhere. But when discussing the GeForce, I'd really like to break the discussion up into two portions. Firstly, discussing the GeForce as a practical gaming product at the time of its release. You know, how it actually performed in games of that era. And secondly, examining GeForce as a design that would influence the future of rendering. You see, the new card introduced a range of key new features that, while somewhat slow in this first generation product, would become useful in and of themselves and form the basis of what was to come. So, I want to start first by discussing GeForce as a product in '99. I actually bought one of these for myself back in the day. There were effectively two variants, one equipped with single data rate memory, released first, and another that shipped in December with double data rate memory instead. There's also a unique variant with SG RAM that sits somewhere between the two in terms of memory performance. If we look back at reviews and benchmarks from '99, it becomes apparent that the GeForce DDR was pretty much the fastest D3D and OpenGL accelerator card you could buy for games in 1999. The main complaint in the reviews was actually focused on the price, which was $299. Now, the Voodoo 3 could still hold its own during this time, but Glide was becoming somewhat less relevant thanks to Direct3D finally maturing. The biggest games of this time period were Unreal Tournament and Quake 3 Arena, which appeared at the end of '99, and the GeForce was very well suited to playing these games at high frame rates, again for the era, and you could even do so with 32-bit color, which was actually usable on this particular card. Now, we're looking at the game running here on a Pentium 3 system, which was another 1999 product from Intel. Frame rates aren't perfect, mind you, but it plays well, it runs smoothly, and it was a huge upgrade over the Voodoo 2, which I kept installed in my machine during this era as well. Of course, when it comes to actually testing the card, one of my favorite tools was the 3D Mark suite of benchmarks. This line of benchmarks got its start as Final Reality, created by the fine folks at Remedy, who would obviously go on to develop Max Payne. This is why you see Max FX technology when running one of these demos, by the way. But there's a lineage with these guys going back to the demo scene, and they managed to build these demos effectively into a regular thing, with major 3D Mark iterations arriving alongside major GPU features and DirectX revisions. 3D Mark 2000 then was released in December '99, and it supported the full suite of DirectX 7 features, such as hardware transform and lighting, which is a key element we'll discuss shortly. Even more than 2 decades later, it's still fun stacking up different cards against one another in 3D Mark. What you're seeing now, for instance, is the GeForce versus the Voodoo 3 3500 TV, which was 3DFX's high-end card for 1999. They both hold up well, but the GeForce definitely runs the benchmark faster and supports all of its features. In fact, it's kind of wild to see just how fast technology was actually moving at this time. 3D Mark 2000 works great on both, but 3D Mark 2001 barely works on the Voodoo 3. The general frame rates are lower, of course, but some of the features aren't even supported here. The Voodoo 3 also had limitations in terms of texture size, which reveals how certain things work, like this screen distortion effect. I think they're actually using a render to texture feature here in order to warp the view, but due to the limitations on Voodoo 3, the resulting image is much chunkier. It's really neat to see this stuff in action. Speaking of Remedy, while this was a high-end system for '99, it was still capable of playing games like Max Payne, which released in 2001. This game supports the features of GeForce 256, such as hardware transform and lighting, and runs remarkably smoothly for such a high-end game released well after the GeForce 256. Remember, the industry was moving really fast at this time, and by the time 2001 rolled around, we already had a GeForce 3. But of course, how the GeForce ran on period-appropriate PCs is interesting, of course, but ultimately it's the legacy of its feature set that is perhaps most interesting from today's perspective. So GeForce 256 supported all of the expected features of 1999, of course, but also introduced things such as fixed function hardware transform and lighting, cubic environment maps, and .3 bump mapping, among others. And by the way, with .3, only the 3D Labs Promedia 3 card had this feature before the GeForce. Now, of course, hardware transform and lighting capabilities were the main discussion point around this card at time of release. And we'll discuss that momentarily, but here's the thing. GeForce is an interesting case where the most publicized feature is perhaps less important than another feature. The feature I'm talking about is cubic environment maps, or cube maps.
GeForce introduced cube maps. And it really is foundational to a lot of rendering that we do today. We still use cube maps in a lot of different ways. And now cube maps, instead of being this kind of sexy feature that was very futuristic, now, I mean, people use cube maps for fallbacks, right, where you don't have ray tracing. And cube maps replace that, take the normal, look it up into a texture, and you get some kind of reflection that shimmered around when the object moved kind of effect. But what it really did, if you imagine we were rendering this city, so having things that kind of looked like proper reflections off buildings, rather than just being this kind of shimmery, sort of glossy-ish texture kind of thing, all of a sudden changed how we thought about things in terms of what you could render. Could you do something that maybe was more important in the gameplay? And I mean, you couldn't render all 6 faces at once in a frame, right? The budgets certainly weren't there for that. But you would be doing like, okay, what's the 2 most dominant faces that I need to update? And you would spread those across multiple frames, and then you would double buffer those. So you would get this sort of as you would drive along. And for the time, it was, staggeringly effective compared to what it was beforehand.
As Phil noted, cube maps are still a critical piece of rendering technology in the modern era and were used heavily over the last 2 decades. It's an interesting point that shows the ripple effect of a single feature over time. Of course, at the time of release, cube maps were relatively slow in the GeForce. You could see the effect used in various tech demos like this. If you were playing around with tech demos back at the time, you almost assuredly remember this little tech demo.
The bubble demo, I mean, everybody remembers the bubble demo, because that was really a cube map demo, and it was really therapeutic because it was one of these ones that you could interact with and just poke the bubble, and it was like a stress ball almost.
But there were others that would follow, and they looked even more impressive. But things did ramp up quickly, and cube maps started to become increasingly common both in demos and actual shipping games. It was especially useful for things like reflections on cars, in, say, a driving game, or creating reflective floors on surfaces. Of course, hardware T&L was the big talking point for the GeForce. At this point, competent 3D cards could handle triangle setup and clipping, as well as the rendering part of the process, which basically determines the correct color for any given pixel that would be displayed after receiving all necessary information to do so. Prior to any sort of 3D accelerator card, though, every aspect of the 3D pipeline was handled on the CPU. 3D cards took over these steps and offered bespoke silicon designed to handle certain new operations, such as texture filtering, but these cards really only helped with the later stages of rasterization. Until this point, transformation and lighting were still calculated on the CPU in consumer 3D setups. GeForce was designed to handle these tasks itself, freeing precious CPU resources in the process. The idea was that you could afford to throw more triangles at a scene now, as the graphics card could handle additional calculations per frame, more than the CPUs of the initial era when it was released. This was a feature introduced in DirectX 7 and available in OpenGL.
I went from finishing a game to having this brand new piece of hardware that I could just completely retarget what polygon budgets would be. So I started playing with it. There was early builds of DirectX 7, which was necessary to make it all work. It was almost like a perfect storm of timing. DirectX 7 came along. We started doing some samples. There was another game at Rage called Midnight GT, which was designed to be hardware accelerated only for T&L. And I was basically just taking their models and getting it running as our own renderer. And I started working on a little prototype for a boxing game, which was something that we fancied building. I changed focus very much after that and started building like a city renderer. You know, it was a classic problem. How do you render something accurately as a city? And we've been playing a lot of Midtown Madness on lunchtimes. That's where it came from. And it was like, yeah, we love this. We love the vibe of the city, but we want detail and we want accuracy. So we were doing this thing which was New York City accurate to the inch. That was our thing. It's like, we're a stupidly daft large project to build with 17 people. And it was really ambitious, and we actually started with, what we started with was we got, if you remember Viewpoint Labs, they had these gigantic models, or what felt like gigantic models at the time. And I literally brought it in and thought, right, I need to be able to render this. This is the minimum bar of what we've got to be able to render. And we used that as the template for the city. And it was just learning stuff about how to make it go faster. You know, learning that when you were doing hardware T&L, the batching was all the more important. But also things like, you know, you spent less time thinking, I'll just throw these polygons away. You would spend more time doing, okay, I'm going to start rendering front to back, because the sort of the depth occlusion culling that was coming from the depth buffer was, you know, it really was fast. And then you could do very coarse things like, we chopped the city up into, it was about 100 meter by 100 meter blocks. So we had potential visibility sets from any block to every other block. So we would know roughly what the minimum that we had to render was per area. And then we would just start throwing those at the GPU in a front to back order. And it was surprisingly fast. And the thing that we learned very quickly was throw a lot of geometry at the GPU in big batches, rather than trying to sort of send piecemeal little bits of graphics data. So it was like, you know, what's the budget for a car? Don't go silly, but it doesn't really matter. That was kind of the conversation we would have, because we were having, you know, Expendable ran at something like, I think it would peak out at about 10,000 polygons a frame. And all of a sudden, GeForce 256 had this somewhere in the order, I think its total throughput per second was about 10 million triangles. So we could throw like 150,000 lit triangles at it in a frame. And I was like, okay, this is a bit different. Got to find ways to drive the hardware quicker. And then we started doing some other stuff such as cube maps, right? Which is a great way to increase the visual fidelity. And at the same time, you know, you get better rendering. But at the same time, you also get, you know, you find a great way to use the existing geometry that you had to enhance the look of how it was.
3D Mark 2000 included hardware T&L with tests like this, demonstrating high polygon counts with multiple light sources. But there were other applications available as well. One of my favorites is actually this, the Degarthmore Zoological Gardens. This is a demo that was bundled with certain GeForce cards back in the day, and I remember playing with this myself. It was created specifically with high polygon counts in mind, up to 100,000 polygons in a scene even. This isn't a game per se, but the studio behind it, WXP, was working on an actual game at this point, and this kind of served as a demo for it. You're given a chance to walk around this gorgeous island filled with smooth hills, detailed trees, and strange creatures. It's a real showpiece for 1999, exhibiting a level of detail we wouldn't see in a shipping PC game for at least a couple of years or more. They followed this up a year later with something called the Isle of Morgue. This was designed for the GeForce 2 line of cards, but it actually runs on GeForce 256 just fine. This one equips the player with a weapon, allowing for increased interactivity. It also features a dynamic time of day system and an even larger map to explore. Both of these basically hinted at what would eventually become possible as polygon budgets were increased for games. Another impressive demo from this era then is known as X-Isle. This impressive demo is what put Crytek on the map after showing it to Nvidia at E3 1999. X-Isle takes full advantage of the feature set of the GeForce 256, including hardware transform and lighting and cube maps, as well as dot 3 bump mapping, which was one of the other forward-looking elements of the GeForce card. The size, scale, and polygon counts on display were unlike any other game at the turn of the century, so not only did it showcase new hardware features, it showcased Crytek itself, and this demo ultimately allowed them to get the contract needed to make the original Far Cry with Ubisoft. This is also cool, and I showed this one briefly earlier. It's Quake 3 Arena, but it's running a map known as NV15, or the Nvidia Bunker. This map was created for GDC 2000 and features a super high polygon count beyond anything else in the original Quake 3 maps. As OpenGL could take advantage of the TNL functions of the card, this turned out to be an interesting yet super demanding test. Now, it doesn't exactly run fast, but it's a good demonstration of where map complexity was slowly going at this time. Yet another demo that GeForce owners are likely familiar with is The Grove. Essentially, this is a customizable tree model that allows you to both increase complexity of the tree while also introducing more lights. When cranked up, it brings this PC to its knees, but also offers a concept of where developers wanted to move with rendering.
A good friend of mine was, he was the PC lead on Test Drive 6, and I think that maybe is the first game to ship a hardware TNL ever. That certainly was one of the very early DirectX 7 games that actually utilized TNL on a GPU that would actually use TNL. But a lot of it was that rethinking, right? Because you had to switch all these lighting tricks that you'd kind of learned in terms of, different things that you would do. All of a sudden, you were sort of using fixed function lights for things, right? Which maybe didn't fall off in the way that you expected them to, or you would do a spotlight. It was all a little bit, a little bit of relearning, because you were moving to more this model of letting the GPU do work, as opposed to trying to do it all on the CPU. But also things like, going back to cube maps, we'd started experimenting with things like using cube maps for lighting. Now these days we'd call them probes, I guess. But we were talking about using cube maps for doing more sort of ambient lighting, or very diffused lighting. So if you were going to render skin, you would potentially use a cube map for rendering skin, because you had this fixed function lighting pipeline, right? So you could render whatever you wanted into the cube map and make it very diffused, and then you could get that sort of really soft skin look. You could do things like Fresnel shading using a cube map, by kind of smart how you set the faces up, because you'd be taking the normals and looking them off into faces. It also had projected texture support, which probably was very underutilized, but projected textures mixed with cube maps, you could do things, you could do interesting things like lanterns, and I think there's an Unreal demo which uses cube maps for a lantern walking through a scene. But you could use it for doing things like clipping shadows, that would be rendered to a face. But I think one of the things that came with that is a lot more people started doing things with render to texture, which again, we do it all the time these days, but render to texture was very sketchy in terms of hardware support, in terms of driver support. And again, at that time, it's where things started coming together as like, look, this is a feature, you've got to support it or they're not going to work properly. And just all of these things, it was like lots of things came together to make sort of the lead up to what would be GeForce 3.
Now, GeForce was not the first card to handle these types of calculations, of course. High-end arcade boards, workstations, and the like all offered similar solutions. but it was the first consumer gaming-focused 3D card for the PC to include these features. Nvidia coined the term GPU, or Graphics Processing Unit, to describe this card, and while it's fair to say that it wasn't the actual first, it is the first time which GPU became a common acronym to describe 3D accelerator cards from this point onwards.
I think it was the first mass market GPU. You know, it's the one that became ubiquitous, right? In terms of using the term. I mean, certainly, whilst I was talking to other vendors at the time, I don't recall the term GPU being used. So to me, GeForce was the first GPU, and I think that is a, you know, I think it's a fair claim that it really was a proper graphics processor, as in it offloaded all the transforming lighting. Like, if you think the entire graphics pipeline was offloaded, and I think that's a pretty reasonable claim for a GPU. That whole sort of GPU thing to be the first.
So the GeForce 256 is an interesting product of its era that, although quickly superseded, was an influential piece of hardware. The GeForce 3 would arrive less than 2 years later, moving from a fixed function pipeline to a fully programmable one, and that would become hugely important for the future, but we can't discount what GeForce 256 brought to the table as is. Which is an interesting thing to discuss, the nature of these first generation products. When you produce a new graphics card, there's usually two routes you can take. One focused purely on raw performance, and the other focused on doing new things. The GeForce is an interesting case though, where it was actually the fastest in terms of performance, but maybe didn't represent the kind of jump you would expect. It was still relatively comparable to the Riva TNT2 of its era, which is the graphics chip that preceded GeForce. But it introduced so many new ideas and features that would become so important to the future of rendering that it's difficult to overlook. And of course, beyond just its graphics capabilities, it was the beginning of what would become the GeForce line of graphics cards, which persists to this very day. Ultimately, looking back at classic graphics cards, always really interesting to me, and I hope you also found this video enjoyable as well. But with that, we've arrived at the end. I hope you've enjoyed this trip down memory lane as we examined the original GeForce card, and maybe even learned something new along the way. But that's going to do it for now, so we'll see you next time.